Some television shows leave behind more than just memories. They leave behind people, real people whose lives were shaped, sometimes permanently, by the experience of being on camera. Alaska Monsters was one of those shows. It ran on Destination America for 4 seasons, beginning in 2013, and it followed a team of self-described monster hunters as they tracked cryptids, legends, and unexplained phenomena across the wilderness of Alaska. It was loud, it was rough around the edges, and it was deeply committed to a world where the unknown lurked just beyond the tree line. But the show ended. And what happened to the people who made it? That story is far less entertaining than anything that aired on television. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because the full picture of where the cast of Alaska Monsters stands in 2026 is more complicated, more sobering, and in some cases more genuinely tragic than any headline has captured. To understand what happened to the people on this show, you first have to understand what Alaska actually is. Not the romantic version, not the television version, but the physical, geographical, economic reality of a state that does not forgive carelessness or misfortune. Alaska is the largest state in the United States by land area, covering approximately 663,000 square miles. It has one of the lowest population densities in the country, with fewer than 2 people per square mile on average. In regions like the interior and the bush, that number drops dramatically. Communities are separated by hundreds of miles of roadless terrain. Winters can push temperatures to -40 degrees Fahrenheit and colder. The wilderness is not a backdrop. It is an active, present force. The people who appear on shows like Alaska Monsters are not actors imported from Los Angeles. They are, by and large, people from that environment or from adjacent rural communities in the lower 48 who live lives shaped by that kind of physical reality. When a show like this ends, they do not return to a green room or a studio backlot. They return to that world. And in that world, the aftermath of minor fame, disrupted routines, and the financial unpredictability of reality television can compound in ways that have no easy resolution. Alaska Monsters premiered on Destination America on October 25, 2013. The network had found a formula with Mountain Monsters, a similar show set in Appalachia that debuted earlier that year. And Alaska Monsters was conceived as a natural extension of that franchise into an even more extreme environment. The premise was straightforward. A team of hunters and researchers, each with their own specialty, would travel to remote Alaskan locations to investigate reported sightings of cryptid creatures. Things like the Tizharuk, a serpentine water creature from Inuit tradition, the Alaskan Bushman, and various other entities drawn from indigenous legend and local folklore. The core cast across the show's run included several recurring figures who became the recognizable faces of the series. There was Crusty, whose real name is Little John Painter, the self-appointed team leader whose combination of bluster and genuine outdoors knowledge gave the show much of its personality. There was Rhett, whose tracking instincts and quieter demeanor served as a counterbalance. There was Mo, the team's designated trapper and one of the most technically minded members of the group. There was Little Bear, a native Alaskan member who added a layer of cultural grounding to the show's engagement with indigenous legends. And there were several others who appeared across multiple seasons in various capacities. The show ran for 4 seasons and concluded in 2015. It was not canceled under dramatic circumstances. Destination America quietly wound down its monster hunting programming block as ratings for the genre softened across the board. The network pivoted toward different content, and just like that, the show was over. Not with a finale or a press release, but with a simple absence from the schedule. For some cast members, the end of the show was just the end of a side chapter in lives that had always been primarily defined by other things. But for others, the years that followed brought genuine hardship. And in 2026, looking back at where the full cast has landed, the picture is uneven in ways that demand honest examination. Little John Painter, known to viewers as Crusty, became arguably the most visible figure from the show after its conclusion, not because of any major professional success, but because of the personal struggles that became public. Crusty was the kind of television personality who seemed invincible on screen. Loud, confident, always ready with a plan, always certain that the next piece of evidence was just around the corner. Off-screen, the years following Alaska Monsters were marked by significant health challenges. He has spoken publicly about physical ailments that are common among men who have spent decades working in demanding outdoor conditions. Joint problems, respiratory issues, the accumulated wear of a life lived hard in difficult environments. The transition away from the structured activity that the show provided however artificial that structure may have been, clearly affected him. By 2024, people who followed the show's social media presence were noting with concern that updates from Crusty had become infrequent, and that his appearance in the limited video content he did share had changed markedly. This is not unusual for people in this specific corner of reality television. The genre attracts people who project strength and resilience, and those projections can make it easy for audiences and even for the people themselves to overlook the physical and psychological toll that aging takes, particularly for those without the financial cushion that mainstream celebrity provides. Destination America did not make anyone wealthy. The budget model for shows of this type, regional cable, lower production costs, minimal residuals, means that most cast members received a flat per-episode fee without the back-end benefits that might sustain someone through years of declining health or changed circumstances. In 2026, Crusty's situation remains one of the more concerning on the roster of people who spent time on that show. Mo, whose full name is Mo Baker, followed a path after the show that was in many ways typical of people from the monster hunting reality genre. He stayed connected to the broader community of enthusiasts and investigators, appeared at regional events, and maintained a social media presence that kept him in conversation with the fan base that shows like Alaska Monsters reliably generate. But that kind of sustained minor engagement with a former audience is not the same as a career. It is, if anything, a maintenance activity, something that provides meaning and connection without providing financial stability. By 2025, Mo had spoken in interviews about the difficulty of returning to a normal working life after having been on television, even briefly. The expectations that form, both the public's expectations and one's own, can create a kind of limbo that is genuinely hard to escape. Rhett, who was among the more reserved members of the Alaska Monsters team, appears to have largely withdrawn from the public sphere following the show's conclusion. This is its own kind of outcome. Some people step back from the spotlight by choice, finding that the exposure was never something they sought for its own sake. Others step back because the aftermath of that exposure has been painful in ways that don't make for easy public discussion. In Rhett's case, the limited information available points towards someone who simply returned to a quieter life in a rural setting. Whether that represents contentment or retreat is genuinely difficult to assess from the outside. What can be said is that in 2026, he is among the least visible of the show's major recurring cast members. Little Bear's trajectory after Alaska Monsters is one of the most layered and, in some respects, the most difficult to discuss without care. As a native Alaskan participant on a show that engaged directly with indigenous cultural traditions and legends, his role was always more complicated than it appeared on camera. The show used indigenous mythology as source material in the way that much cryptid-focused television does, as a kind of flavor, as evidence of deep local knowledge, as something that lent credibility to the investigation. But the relationship between that kind of representation and the actual communities from which those traditions come is rarely examined honestly in the broadcast itself. After the show ended, Little Bear's public presence was largely confined to occasional posts and comments within fan communities. The larger cultural conversation about the way indigenous knowledge and legend has been commodified by reality television, a conversation that has grown significantly in the years since Alaska Monsters aired, has not typically centered on individuals like him, but it is a conversation that gives important context to his trajectory. There is also the matter of the show's broader relationship to the communities it depicted. Alaska Monsters, like Mountain Monsters and similar programs, operated in a specific cultural space, one where rural, working-class identity, often from communities with significant economic challenges, was packaged as entertainment for a national cable audience. The people on screen were real. The struggles of the regions they came from were real, but the format required a particular kind of performance, performative bravado, theatrical certainty, exaggerated reactions that did not always map onto the lived reality of those individuals or those places. When the cameras stopped rolling, the performance stopped, but the identity that had been built around it for cast members who had leaned into it did not simply dissolve. This is one of the central dynamics that explains why the aftermath of shows like Alaska Monsters can be so difficult for the people involved. Television creates a version of you, heightened, edited, narratively simplified, and that version accumulates an audience. When the show ends, the audience doesn't entirely disappear. Fans continue to follow, to ask questions, to expect updates, but the infrastructure that supported the television version of you is gone. There are no producers arranging the investigations. There are no cameras creating the sense that what you're doing has importance and audience. There is just the ordinary world, which has no particular interest in treating you as a character in an ongoing story. The financial dimension of this cannot be overstated. Reality television on second-tier cable networks in the early 2010s operated on very different economic terms than even modest scripted television. Fees for cast members on shows like Alaska Monsters are generally estimated to have ranged from a few hundred to perhaps a few $1,000s per episode for the non-lead participants. Even for the more prominent figures, multi-season participation in a show of this type would not have generated the kind of savings that insulates someone from future hardship. And reality television contracts, particularly for shows of this type, rarely include meaningful residual structures. Every time Alaska Monsters airs in syndication or streams on a platform, the revenue flows primarily to the production company and the network, not to the people who appeared in it. By 2026, the show is available on streaming platforms. It gets watched. It finds new audiences, often younger viewers who discover it through algorithms or recommendations. Those views generate revenue for rights holders. They do not generate meaningful income for most of the cast. It is worth pausing here to address what the mainstream coverage of Alaska Monsters and its cast has largely missed. Most of the articles written about the show, when they are written at all, which is infrequently, focus on the entertainment product. Did the team catch anything? Were the monsters real? What were the best episodes? These are not unreasonable questions for entertainment journalism to ask, but they completely bypass the more interesting and more consequential story, which is about what it means to build a piece of your public identity around a specific kind of performance in a specific kind of media environment, and then have that environment simply withdraw its support. The monster hunting genre was a product of a very specific moment in cable television. The early 2010s saw an explosion of what became known as blue-collar reality, shows built around working-class men in extreme environments, doing extreme things. Deadliest Catch, Duck Dynasty, Swamp People, Mountain Monsters, Alaska Monsters. These shows drew enormous ratings for their respective networks at their peaks. They were genuine cultural phenomena in certain demographics. But cable television's ratings model was already beginning to deteriorate by the mid-2010s, and the genre that had seemed so durable turned out to be tied very specifically to a particular moment in the media landscape. As cord-cutting accelerated, as streaming fragmented audiences, as the networks themselves began to pivot and rebrand, the shows were canceled or quietly shelved. The moment passed. The people in those shows did not pass with it. They continued to exist in communities that had been, in many cases, economically distressed for decades before the cameras arrived and remained economically distressed after the cameras left. Rural Alaska, rural Appalachia, rural Louisiana. These are not places that were waiting to be saved by cable television. They have their own persistence, their own dignity, their own complex trajectories. But for specific individuals who had become publicly identified with a genre that had simply ceased to be commercially viable, the post-television years carried a particular weight. Several cast members from the broader Alaska Monsters and Mountain Monsters universe have passed away in the years since their shows ended. This is a sobering fact, and one that gets at something important about the demographics of the shows themselves. These were not shows staffed by young men at the beginning of their careers. Many of the participants were in their 40s, 50s, and 60s when they filmed. They were men whose bodies showed the wear of decades of physical labor, hunting, trapping, outdoor work. By 2026, the passage of time has been unsparing. In the specific case of Alaska Monsters, the cast was somewhat younger on average than Mountain Monsters, but the underlying dynamic is the same. The people who appear in these shows age. They face health challenges that are common to their demographics and their lifestyles, and they face those challenges with the financial resources and support systems available to people in their specific communities, which are, for many, significantly limited. The question of what responsibility, if any, a network or production company bears for the people it puts on screen and then withdraws support from is one that the television industry has never satisfactorily answered. There is no institutional framework that provides ongoing support for reality television participants after their shows end. There is no equivalent of a union health plan, no residual structure worth speaking of for this tier of production, no outreach from former employers as time passes and circumstances change. The people simply leave the screen and re-enter a world that has no particular mechanism for catching them. This is not a problem unique to Alaska Monsters. It is endemic to reality television as an industry. But Alaska Monsters provides a particularly clear case study because the cast members were so explicitly drawn from high-risk environments, both geographically and economically, and because the show's premise so directly commodified their identity and their specific relationship to a particular landscape. The show sold the idea of these men as uniquely capable survivors, as people who could handle anything the Alaskan wilderness threw at them. It did not prepare them, could not prepare them, for the specific kind of vulnerability that comes from being briefly famous in a declining genre on a mid-tier cable network. By 2026, the fan communities that formed around Alaska Monsters still exist, primarily on social media platforms. They are smaller than they were at the show's peak, but they are persistent. Within those communities, there is genuine care for the cast members. Fans who have followed Crusty's health updates with concern, fans who miss Rhett's laconic presence on screen, fans who appreciated Little Bear's knowledge and wonder what he's doing now. This kind of low-level sustained fandom is one of the stranger byproducts of the reality television era, an ongoing emotional investment in real people whose public lives have largely ended, maintained in the absence of any new content through speculation, nostalgia, and occasional direct contact when cast members engage with their former audiences. Some cast members have leveraged this fandom more successfully than others. The reality television market for nostalgia is real. There are conventions, podcasts, YouTube channels, and fan events that can provide modest income and continued relevance for people willing to engage with that ecosystem. But this requires a specific kind of energy and self-promotional willingness that not everyone possesses or wants to possess. For those who were on Alaska Monsters primarily because they had a specific skill set and an interest in the subject matter, not because they were drawn to performance or public life, the idea of sustaining a public identity through conventions and social media engagement can feel alien or simply exhausting. The show itself, when watched now in 2026, has a particular quality that shows of its type often acquire over time, something between nostalgia and elegy. It is a document of a specific moment. The landscapes are real and they are breathtaking. The weather is real, the cold is real, whatever one thinks of the cryptid claims, and the evidence on screen never rose above suggestive at best. The physical reality of what the cast endured in terms of environment and conditions was genuine. These were men standing in sub-zero temperatures in remote Alaskan wilderness doing something they believed in, filmed by a small crew with limited resources. There is something honest in that, even when the narrative frame around it was thoroughly constructed for entertainment purposes. When viewers encounter that content now, they are watching people who have moved on, aged, faced difficulties, and in some cases been diminished by time and circumstance. The gap between the person on screen, confident, capable, centrally important to an ongoing story, and the person in 2026, navigating the ordinary challenges of an ordinary life without the camera's organizing presence, can be very wide. That gap is part of what makes these retrospective examinations feel, when done honestly, genuinely sad. There is also the question of legacy, not in the grand sense, but in the specific sense of what a show like Alaska Monsters left behind in terms of the cultural and intellectual conversation it was part of. The cryptid investigation genre has genuine roots in legitimate folklore studies, in indigenous cultural preservation, in the psychology of belief and the human tendency to find meaning in the unexplained. Alaska Monsters engaged with all of those themes in its own idiosyncratic way, and there were moments, particularly in its engagement with indigenous Alaskan legend through cast members like Little Bear, where it touched on something that deserved more serious treatment. In 2026, the conversation around indigenous knowledge systems, around the validity of oral tradition as a form of evidence, around the way rural and indigenous communities have been represented in popular media, is significantly more sophisticated than it was in 2013. Alaska Monsters is a time capsule of a less thoughtful moment in that conversation. What does it mean for the people involved that the show they made has been both preserved and contextually complicated by that passage of time? For most cast members, it probably means very little on a day-to-day basis. But it is worth noting that the cultural product they helped create exists in a more complex relationship to truth and representation than the show itself ever acknowledged, and that the people most directly implicated in that complexity, particularly cast members from indigenous backgrounds, have had to navigate that context largely without institutional support or public acknowledgement. In the final accounting, what can be said about the cast of Alaska Monsters in 2026 is this: they are a group of people who were drawn into a specific media moment, gave something of themselves to that moment, and were then released back into the world when the moment passed. Some of them have managed that transition with more resources than others. Some have found ways to remain connected to the communities and the subject matter they cared about on the show. Some have struggled with health, with finances, with the particular psychological difficulty of having been briefly and publicly defined in a way that their current lives do not reflect or sustain. The tragic dimension of their story is not dramatic or acute in most cases. It is the quieter tragedy of misalignment between the person the camera created and the person who has to live after the camera leaves, between the brief expansion of identity that television provides and the contraction that follows, between the implied promise of visibility and the reality of invisibility that follows cancellation. This is not unique to this cast or this show, but this cast and this show provide a clear and specific example of how that dynamic plays out for people in this particular corner of the media landscape. The wilderness that formed the backdrop of Alaska Monsters is unchanged. The Brooks Range still rises above the tree line in the same severe and indifferent way it did when the cameras were rolling. The rivers still run cold. The dark still comes for months at a time. Whatever moved in those woods during filming, whether it was evidence of something unknown or the ordinary movement of a landscape full of ordinary wildlife, has continued to move without documentation, without a film crew, without the organizing framework of a television narrative that needed a conclusion. The people who went looking in those woods are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s now. Some are in poorer health than they were. Some are dealing with the financial pressures that are the default condition of working-class life in rural America. Some are simply living, quietly, without fanfare, as far from the heightened world of cable television as geography and circumstance have taken them. They are real. Their difficulties are real. Their stories, in 2026, are more complex and more human than anything that ever aired on Destination America on Friday nights. That is worth knowing. That is worth sitting with if you spent any time watching them hunt for something in the dark.